Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to our presentation as JAKALA and Acquia. We want to be able to speak to you today about accessibility in the higher education space. We will be getting started. I do want to make a note at the top of the call here before we jump in. We will have some points throughout this presentation for interaction where we will have the Q&A area open for your comments, suggestions, questions, as well as answers. We do like to make these as interactive as possible, so we hope you join and participate with us. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get us started by introducing our presenters today. We're going to go ahead and start with Cheney.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Cheney Kourouniotis. I am the Director of Client Success here at JAKALA. So I work with all of our higher education clients in the digital experience platform space to help build websites and web platforms that work for students, for alumni, for all manner of constituencies that a university needs to support, and ensure that everyone who comes to our clients' university sites can get the information they need, can engage with the institution in the way that works best for them, and have a good digital experience that matches the experience they're having with the school. Also relevant for today's discussion, I'm a veteran of higher ed myself. I used to work at both Stanford and at UC Berkeley back when I lived in California some years ago. And so topics like these are always very near and dear to my heart. I'm excited to be chatting with you today. Let me take a turn to introduce Tom over at Acquia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cheney. Again, thank you everybody for joining in here. My name is Thomas Mason, formerly worked at Moncito and now Acquia, helping advise organizations across the public sector. So higher education, municipalities, cities, counties, state organizations, better understand their web presence and make sure they're adhering to all the accessibility guidelines across the board. So really excited to speak with you all today. And again, thanks so much for joining in.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. So I'm going to kick us off. So today we've got essentially 4 areas we want to cover today. We'll spend a few minutes talking about the accessibility landscape for today and getting some of your feedback about some of the challenges that you might be facing working in this area. And then we're going to break down our problem solving into 2 areas. Tom's going to talk a bit about the types of tools and technical capabilities that are available to you to address these challenges. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the governance and compliance challenges that come in particular with ensuring accessibility across a large institution, across a range of autonomously functioning departments and units, each of whom have different processes for creating websites, for putting up content, for updating and managing that content. So we're going to talk a little bit about the human side of that as well. And then we're going to wrap up with some concrete next steps that you can take right away to move in the direction of full compliance, and have some time as well for questions and answers at the end. So with that, Ashley, let's take us ahead a slide. So before Tom and I get started talking at you for a little bit, we're going to do this full classroom style since we are a higher ed group after all. And I'd love to invite you to open up the Q&A box and type in there the first word that comes to your mind when you think about managing accessibility in today's landscape. We're going to enjoy some awkward silence for a moment while people type those in. Lawsuits. Yep, that is certainly highly present on a lot of people's mind, and we are going to talk about legal and regulatory compliance today. Anybody else want to put some stuff in there? Experience. Yep. Overwhelming. Absolutely right. There's a lot to cover. It can be quite a lot to manage. And typically, another thing we're going to talk about today is that accessibility and compliance officers often struggle with the limited resources when trying to deal with an expanded set of capabilities. Education. Yep. There's a lot to learn about. And we also have some ideas for resources for you guys at the end of this call. Well, that's a great start for us. And you all, I also see ADA Title II. Yep, we're going to talk about that right next. Decentralized website management, ensuring accessibility throughout. Yeah, these are top of mind for a lot of folks in your positions today. So we're going to talk about a few of those now. So you guys hit the nail on the head here, especially when calling it overwhelming, decentralized, challenging to keep up with. Complicated was certainly the first word that came to my head when I was putting together some of the information about this. If you are responsible for accessibility at your institution in any way, whether you're a program officer, a content editor, a web manager, a volunteer, or perhaps a staffer who simply wants to help ensure that this work is being done, there are so many aspects of it that can be pretty hard to get your arms around. Right? On a design side, you may be dealing with sites whose front end design is out of compliance, and that can mean everything from how the content is written to the typography, to use of tables, to font size, to color contrast. Those are things typically that outside of the visual design sphere, a lot of staffers don't work in or know the details of. But that's the type of thing that can cause you to become out of compliance on any of your sites in your portfolio. Alternatively, you may also be needing to think about back-end technologies and whether they are compatible with an ever-changing list of assistive devices. You might need to be thinking about how AI and chatbots are interacting with your site and whether those experiences are accessible and compliant. And we also need to be thinking about the back-end authoring experience as well. Most of the clients we work with understand, of course, that an accessible front-end user experience is paramount, but your staff also deserve a fully compliant experience. And if some of them are working with disabilities that make it difficult to do their work, back-end compliance is also a challenge that needs to be addressed at a lot of institutions. Now, when it comes to legal compliance, you are dealing with a patchwork of ever-shifting regulatory requirements across different jurisdictions. And of course, there are also evolving expectations as to what conditions or needs are covered. Most folks who are working in accessibility now are pretty familiar with, the needs to be compliant for folks with a variety of physical disabilities, whether it's mobility, whether it's reading, being able to engage with the content in whatever way works best for them. But other conditions are sort of coming into focus now, such as neurodivergence, and whether websites need to be organized in a certain way to present information the best way for neurodivergent readers. With an aging American population, you have more and more people falling into some of the areas that previously might have only been covered by legislation that touches on folks with disabilities that have gone on throughout their lifetime. But you start having more users who may struggle with sight or with reading on a small screen, that sort of thing. So all of those are challenges that present themselves as well. And then, of course, there's the topic we're going to focus on fairly heavily today, which is governance. Getting your entire ecosystem of content into a compliant state, it requires addressing things like copywriting and content creation, video captioning, document accessibility, visual design. The whole thing, as one of you already put on this, can really be quite overwhelming. So we're going to break this down a little bit for you and go through a couple of the areas that we think are key to focus on first and most urgently. So if you take us to the next slide. As the first person who dropped a word into the chat, I think really sort of put the nail on the head, which is staying legally compliant, right? This is often of first and most urgent concern for a lot of institutions. Every organization wants to support this as a matter of ethics, but there is also an institutional imperative to understand legal compliance and to reduce legal risk for the institution. So there are a lot of different types of regulations happening right now that may affect your institution either immediately or in the near future. As one of you posted in the chat, the new DOJ Title II ruling, which requires state and local governments to make their websites and their mobile apps fully digitally accessible. This covers public schools and universities. So we have a number of institutions that are going to fall under this requirement in the coming couple of years. So this applies not only to websites and apps, but to the digital documents that exists on those sites. And as a former university staffer myself, I am fully aware of the number of fully inaccessible PDFs that are lurking on everyone's websites in this webinar. That includes Word docs, spreadsheets, presentation files. All of these digital assets and experiences are going to be required to be in conformance with WCAG 2.1 AA within the next couple of years. So for large public entities, that deadline is within 2 years of the date of publication of this rule, which was April of this year, so April 2026. And smaller entities are given a little bit more time to comply. They have 3 years. They have until 2027. So this ruling applies to public schools and universities, but the requirement for private institutions is probably not far behind. There is a great likelihood that should the political administration remain the same after the upcoming elections, it's quite likely that the Department of Justice would then update Title III, which applies to private businesses, in the same manner and require this type of accessibility across all of their digital means of engaging with their users and customers. These days, even now, most accessibility lawsuits fall under Title III, not Title II, because it's happening in engagement with private businesses. And so most experts are suggesting that even private universities take this Title II ruling quite seriously and prepare for it to apply to Title III as well in the coming years, potentially. In addition to that, those of you who are working with international students, we have the European Accessibility Act to be concerned about, which is a similar ruling that's going to require the same sites, apps, and materials to be fully accessible according to EU requirements in the coming years. And not to be outdone by Europe, California is considering currently putting forward legislation for review, AB 1757, which would set WCAG 2.1 AA as the de facto standard for websites and mobile apps that can be accessed from California, meaning functionally this then applies to the entire United States, as most organizations realize that trying to be compliant for one state in the US really simply isn't feasible. So California is really starting to set some national standards for this. So all of these compliance requirements can be quite challenging and quite confusing, although there is space available in many of them for good faith efforts for conformance and some flexibility in understanding what full conformance really means. In general, we are moving away from a world in which accessibility is a recommended guideline and a nice to have into a world where it's required. And that's going to be pretty powerful for the 16% of people around the world who live with disabilities. And it's going to be a heavy lift for the organizations who need to be able to support that with a variety of challenges facing them. So Ashley, if you can move us ahead to the next slide. There are 3 main challenges that we typically see our clients facing in trying to manage accessibility to the best of their ability. The first one is, as we were talking about, those evolving guidelines, requirements, and laws. Accessibility is not a one and done process. You cannot simply make your website conform and then call it a day and go home. The rules continue to change. The set of tools and technologies that your site needs to support continues to change. When your tools and technologies change, your design and your branding all change. All of that still needs to be addressed. And so these requirements are living, breathing concepts that always need to be dealt with in an ongoing fashion. That's one challenge. The second one is, of course, supporting these increasingly large portfolios of work with shrinking resources. Even if your institution is lucky enough to have a dedicated ADA compliance office or team, you are typically responsible for a much larger portfolio of sites than you can actually service and upgrade with the resources and time that you have. And for a lot of smaller organizations, there is no dedicated team. You may have a champion or an officer, either embedded within departments or simply someone to whom that is a portion of your other responsibilities. But in general, there is more work to be done than can be done by the teams who are on the ground handling this. And that's a huge challenge. The third one is the one we're talking about today, which is driving adherence across massive decentralized university systems where you, the accessibility officer or champion, don't have a lot of control over what kinds of information and content goes onto these sites, how it's handled, how it's presented, and how to get them into full compliance. And then you find yourself sort of trying to figure out what ways you can improve that compliance, encourage that adherence when you don't have the authority to enforce or require it. Before we go on to tackling a couple of those I'd love to invite folks to put chat in one more time. Are there any challenges you're facing that don't fall under one of these three categories? Is there something you'd like to hear us talk a little bit about today that doesn't really fall under any of these three umbrellas? I'm going to guess quietness and a lack of typing means most of you are dealing with some combination of these three challenges. Hopefully just one, but I'm imagining there's a world in which most of you are dealing at some level with all three. So we're going to touch on quite a few of them as we go along today, but in particular, we're going to lean a little bit on the third one. So if we move ahead to the next slide, Ashley. Where we see most of our university clients operating in this space is that typically the flagship sites of most institutions that we work with have already had the core accessibility compliance areas addressed. Universities have really taken the lead on this issue in the last years and frequently have a lot to teach private businesses and other industries about how this should be done. But when you start to get off the flagship site and off of the other main sites where most of the traffic happens, you start to see a pretty steep drop off in accessibility compliance, in best practices, and in uses of the correct types of design, technologies, and content guidelines that make for highly accessible websites. And that's, you know, that's not really anyone's fault necessarily. It's a difficult set of requirements to keep up with. It requires some specialized knowledge. And again, it requires resources that especially the smaller units at an institution are not likely to have. So your institution might have an accessibility office or team who can help these smaller units, or they might not, and they might be asked to handle it on their own, in which case it's likely to fall a little bit further down their priority list than some of the other challenges they're being asked to deal with. And so as we start to look at ways to think about how we might improve the situation across your entire portfolio, I'm going to hand over to Tom to talk a little bit about what are the accessibility tools that can help you support your content editors across the university in identifying and remediating some of these problems. So let me pause for a moment here myself and hand over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Janie. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about problem solving with accessibility tools. If you could go to the next slide. Across my section here, you know, really just going to give kind of the 10,000 foot view on the web accessibility tool landscape. And then from there, we'll dive into one of these categories here and give you a look at what one of these tools actually looks like and how it typically helps some of these large organizations with many different content editors. So categories typically fall into three different areas. So the widget slash JavaScript overlay solutions, the web governance platforms, and then manual testing and remediation. So starting at the top, the widget and overlay solutions, they're going to be the quickest fix. They're going to be the tools that you can implement the fastest, but they are only temporary fixes. And what that means is that because the JavaScript overlay, it's not actually fixing the backend issues that your website has. This means that if you were to have a tool for 5 years, for example, you then lose funding, lose some budget, you have to cut back and remove that tool, your site will get reverted back to its un-ADA compliant ways. It also means that you're not able to remedy all accessibility issues with an overlay. This is because certain accessibility issues need manual human intervention. It does typically tend to be the lowest cost option. It does come with some baggage as well. So it's controversial among the accessibility community to be using the overlays. There is some kind of popular overlays that have gotten some flack because people within the disability community have felt like the overlays kind of inhibit their ability to use screen readers effectively to navigate to the site, among other issues there. So that'll be the overlay solution option. There's also the web governance platforms. So web governance platforms are typically scanning tools that are going to locate where accessibility issues are across the site, and then give your team some guidance and instruction on how to actually permanently fix those issues in the back end of your website. The primary reason they came about and their kind of core focus is accessibility. they do tend to look at broader topics outside of accessibility as well. So things like SEO, broken links, misspellings, site page speed as well. So it tends to be a comprehensive solution, one that falls from a price range probably in the middle between the overlays and this final category here, which is going to be manual testing and remediation. So manual testing and remediation, typically a vendor will actually join the development lifecycle. So help to build your site at its core to be accessible. With that comes the highest cost. So typically somewhere in the range of over $100,000, even for one individual site. So if we go to the next slide here, we're going to dive specifically into a web governance platform. So Acquia's newest acquisition is of Moncito, and it does fall into that web scanning and auditing tool category. So automated scanning, where Moncito will locate where your WCAG errors are, give you some training and support to better understand, okay, once we know where the issues are, how do we actually go in there and fix them? With the end goal of not only taking some of the pressure off of the people that are managing the team and help having the content editors empowered to make their own fixes, but then of course wanting to reduce any sort of risk of a complaint of a lawsuit. And part of the way that Moncito does that is by having detailed reporting, right? We know we have that kind of timeline that Cheney talked about, 2016 or 2026 or 2027, depending on the size of the organization. That puts you in kind of a good spot now to start to be able to show progress over time. Again, as Cheney was mentioning, kind of that good faith effort, and you can kind of track that accessibility progress with a tool, with a web governance tool. If you go to the next slide, please. And then a big way that we can help when it comes to managing these large teams is making sure that we're prioritizing the content, focusing on what matters most. Realistically, maintaining 100% ADA compliance is something that's not feasible. So you want to make sure we can direct your team towards the areas of the site that it makes the most sense. For Moncito specifically, what that means is looking at what are those pages with the most accessibility issues that are also getting some of the most views, right? So your team isn't spending time fixing issues on that one page that's gotten one view in the last 12 months, and can at least start out by focusing on those higher traffic pages with more issues before slowly working down to the lower priority pages. So now I'm going to share my screen, and that way we can give you a look at what an actual site scan would look like. So hopefully that's coming through on your end. And what you're looking at here is a typical scan that a product like Moncito would do. And at its core, again, it's going to be an auditing tool. And what the end editor will see, the content editor, will be a checklist of accessibility issues, which they can then use to go highlight directly on the page where an accessibility issue is. So typical for web governance platforms to have a browser extension to show where the issue is. And then again, we want to empower those content editors to understand, what is this issue? Why is it an issue? And how can I make that fix? So self-help areas that kind of detail exactly that, give you an idea of how this specific accessibility check impacts an individual with disabilities, and then gives you that advice on how to remedy that specific issue. Now, that's what the end editor will see. When it comes to a manager and helping manage these large teams, they want to be able to distribute out that work. Part of the way web governance tools will do that is by labeling. So you can see I put my name down here, and this is a way for managers to be able to assign out work to individuals on their team so that they can work on their sections of the site and the specific checks that their manager wants them to work on. Then once those checks have been fixed, the manager can then have an audit log to be able to see what is each individual user doing. Gives them that bird eye view. Instead of having to constantly check in with that individual, they can actually go into a platform and see all the different users listed out. For some higher education organizations using web governance platforms, that might be hundreds of users. So they can go into those individual users, verify that they're working on their sections of the site. Now, you can either look at the whole site all in one scan, or as Cheney was mentioning, right, maybe your main site's doing great, but you have some subdomains that you want to be able to verify that they are accessible. You can actually break up that main site into different sections. So you can see I've sectioned off the admissions aid section, alumni, future students, partners, and you can break it up however you'd like. So we notice a lot of higher education organizations, they have content editors assigned to certain sections of the website. So this is a great way to get a little bit more granular and specific to see, okay, what are our sections of our site that are doing really great, and what are the sections that really need some help. Again, when you've got a site with hundreds of pages, thousands of pages, being able to break it up can make it a little bit more manageable and easier to start chipping away at any sort of accessibility issues. Another benefit of an ongoing maintenance and ongoing auditing tool is that as those accessibility guidelines change over time, you can actually assign or be able to select what accessibility guidelines you want to scan your site on. So you can see I've set it to WCAG 2.1 AA, but you can have that flexibility to adjust whether it's 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, and then going all the way from single A to AAA, right? As new checks get added in there, those can be directly put into the platform, and that way you don't have to have your ear as close to the ground on individual checks, and you can rely on that vendor to be implementing them, and you can always change the level of accessibility adherence you want for a specific domain. And the last point that I would go towards is just PDF accessibility. Again, as Cheney mentioned, that tends to be one that can fall by the wayside. So being able to scan your PDFs, maybe you built it 5 years ago, it was accessible back then, there's new guidelines now. And so you're able to actually scan PDFs inside of a web governance platform to figure out, okay, what's wrong with it? That way I can make some adjustments and make sure it's up to the current standards. So I'll stop sharing now and we'll hop back into the presentation. And this last slide here really just summarizes what I talked about. So using a tool, right, you can get an overview of how your website's performing, be able to keep track of which users are making accessibility fixes on the site. Again, really helpful for those larger teams. And then you can break down your main site into smaller portions to make it more digestible and figure out where to focus your attention, and then have that PDF accessibility monitoring as well, so that those can get put more towards the forefront of the accessibility and your kind of plan going forward. So perfect, that's my section right here, and I'll pass it back to Cheney now.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. So moving from the opportunities to problem solve with tools, we also want to talk for a few minutes about how to problem solve with people. So Ashley, if you advance us to the next slide. Moncito is one of a great suite of tools that helps you identify where the most urgent areas of concern are, what you need to prioritize in order to ensure you're compliant on the most important sites in your portfolio. But once you know that information, how do you get your content editors to prioritize these changes? If you're asking them to edit copy, that's usually pretty easy. If you're asking them to make changes to their design or to their code base, that is a much higher lift. And although everyone agrees that accessibility is an ethical imperative, your content editors, your stakeholders are also dealing with a wide variety of other imperatives, often considered more time sensitive or urgent, being imposed on them by their own stakeholders, their leadership, their responsibilities, and their own limited sets of resources. So let's talk for a few minutes about how we might align your goals for improving accessibility across the institution, or indeed your responsibility for doing so, with what your stakeholders and content editors care about. So once you have information to hand about where changes might need to be made, how do you work with them to ensure those changes actually happen? So there are a few things that certainly I have learned in my work in higher ed, and that we've learned working with clients over the years, that really help make it easier to drive change like this when you're working really at the operational level with the folks who are responsible for taking the time, making the effort, and potentially authorizing different decisions to make the kind of changes to a site that are needed. In a lot of cases, what your site owners and stakeholders care about, they've got problems and goals of their own, right? Chances are they almost all have things they wish were different about their site already. They probably have UX challenges they're dealing with. They probably have the back-end content authoring challenges that they find quite frustrating. There's probably already a long list that they have of changes they'd like to make to their site. If those types of changes are in the works for them already, there is an opportunity for you to align the accessibility changes with the work that they may already be contemplating or doing. to take advantage of whatever changes they're already making. And indeed, you also have the opportunity to talk to them about how accessibility supports their own core website goals. So we know, for example, that search engines are increasingly scanning for good accessibility practices, meaning this can potentially have a pretty noticeable impact on your search engine rankings and by extension, your traffic. It's also relevant for UX overall. Good accessibility has an impact on a lot of the factors that may matter the most to your site owners and stakeholders: bounce rates, conversion rates, time on page, etc. So there may be opportunities to align these priorities with the ones that are most urgent and top of mind for them, and take advantage of changes they may want or need or already be planning to put some of these accessibility improvements into practice as well. Other things that are going to be top of mind for the folks that you talk to, honestly, trust is an issue, and everyone who works at higher ed knows about this. Typically, if you are coming from, let's say, a central department or program at the institutional level, and you're working with folks at a different unit, at a school, a college, a research institute, something like that, politics are famously challenging at universities, and sometimes the trust isn't there. And again, that means it's very, very helpful when you are approaching content editors or site owners, and you are asking them to make sometimes pretty significant changes to the way that their site presents and the way that they do their work. That's going to require approaching them with some empathy, some understanding of how they might feel about having that ask made of them, and ways that you can build trust, that you are not there to make their jobs and their lives harder, but that you are operating in partnership with them to help ensure that their site is offering the best and most accessible experience for everyone who wants to come to it. They also are going to have logistical concerns. Again, if some of these changes may be easy and simple, and some of them may be deeply significant, depending on what the nature of the changes that need to be made and the nature of their site currently. If they're operating on older and more outdated technology that's not compatible with modern assistive devices, that's a much bigger ask than having them come in and perhaps change the color contrast on the site that they're using. And so, again, coming at this with some understanding of what their concerns are going to be is going to be very, very helpful in moving you forward to find solutions together as colleagues, as teammates. They also are going to have to manage both up and down when it comes to making changes to their sites. Either they have to ask their own staff to take time out of their workday to make anything from minor to major changes to the site, and they also have to explain to their own supervisors why they may be taking time and resources out of other priorities to address these things. And so in each of these cases, it's really critical to think about what might matter most to them when you are coming to them to talk about making this change that's so important to accessibility across the institution, but for them is one in a long list of other things they are also responsible for. And so if we move ahead to the next slide, we're thinking not only about what matters most to them, but how you can help them. How can you support them in moving forward on these kinds of processes? And so we put together a little list of some concrete steps that you can take, regardless of your own position in the institution right now, potentially to help move some of these things forward. One of them in particular is making sure that you have created and are regularly updating your VPAT. That is the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. It's essentially a checklist that enables you to determine how compliant your products or websites are. These are updated regularly, and it's important to stay on top of them. So you have an opportunity to go back and do this checklist review regularly over time. Quarterly is often a good way of doing that, to see what are the areas where you might be falling out of compliance or need improvement, what are areas where you need to begin work that you weren't working on compliance before, and sort of using it as sort of a master checklist or a guideline of how your sites are performing against these. Offering regular training sessions can really be critical. It may be that a lot of your content editors are not so much resistant to the extra work that you're asking them to put in, but simply don't know where to begin themselves. And so training sessions for content creators can be very, very helpful in giving them the tools that they need to make sure that their day-to-day content updates and the decisions they're making about their sites are moving in the direction of accessibility compliance, offering them sort of practical steps forward that they can take is going to be very, very helpful. If your institution doesn't already have an accessibility officer, or if you're at a unit within your institution that doesn't have one, designating one can really be very powerful. Even if you can't get necessarily the budget approval to have a new hire dedicated to that, coming up with ways to make it a core responsibility of an individual or a team across departments can be very, very powerful in helping ensure you have someone whose job it is to continue looking at this. So you might, for example, add this responsibility to a team of communications officers across different units at the institution, and then you don't have any one individual who's responsible for handling all of it by themselves. But potentially it could be more of a champion model in which, rather than being solely responsible for compliance all by themselves, you have folks whose job it is to move this project forward as best they can under the circumstances as things change across their departments and as initiatives, projects, and priorities come and go and evolve over time. We talked a little bit about accessibility checkers and accessibility testing tools that can be easily implemented directly into your CMS, just to automate checks for those really common issues and just make it a little bit easier for you to find that low-hanging fruit or anything that might set off alarm bells when it comes to compliance. And in conjunction with those training sessions, a place where your team can go to access resources on this is going to be critical. There are a lot of different places across the internet where you can find information and resources. A couple of good ones that we particularly like, the organization High Ed Web, which provides a lot of information and support on technology and website management in the university space. They have an accessibility summit every year and a lot of great associated resources that go with it. And also is simply staying up to date on WCAG guidelines, going in and checking them. It's a good complement to your VPAT to just sort of have a place where you can go through a list of steps and understand more about where you might need to focus your efforts. But the Resources Hub is a great way, again, to make it as easy as possible for your content editors to keep accessibility in mind when they are working on their own sites. And then a slightly bigger lift, which will move us in just a moment into sort of the steps you can take over the longer term. Thinking about pre-built templates for use across your institution that have accessibility baked into them. And so actually, if we actually move to the next slide, there are a couple of things you can tackle if you are ready for longer term steps. If your institution is ready to look at this in a much more scalable fashion, then we don't stop looking at issues of individual content management, but we start also looking at what are the institution-wide capabilities that we can offer that would improve accessibility across the board. So for example, ensuring that accessibility best practices are built into design systems and code bases that get shared across the institution. Many universities have web service departments where they offer pre-built templates and code bases for standing up new sites for programs, schools, and departments, ensuring that those have accessibility practices baked in, and again, coming back to them, right? They'll have accessibility, maybe perhaps, WCAG 2.1 built in from the last release, but if we need to be looking at changes to the guidelines or more restrictive requirements coming out of some of these rulings, then those designs and code bases need to be assessed again to ensure that they are continuing to provide that level of accessibility compliance. So doing this at a level that enables it to be institution-wide is a significant step forward. It's obviously a much heavier lift than offering individual training to content editors across the university, but these are the types of directions we're seeing more institutions move in parallel with the regulatory environment shifting. So document accessibility is another one. That's going to come under the DOJ Title II ruling, but a lot of organizations are trying to get their arms around it now. Dealing with inaccessible PDFs and spreadsheets and presentations can be a real challenge. And so coming up with systematic ways to address that across the entire institution, again, a good opportunity to make a major step forward in a way that will be particularly meaningful and address a challenge that's been a thorny one for quite some time when it comes to accessibility. And then, of course, one of the major steps that it seems likely we'll see more institutions move towards in the near future is sort of following the DOJ's lead on this and going from encouraging voluntary compliance to requiring it. It's going to be legally required for public universities as it is. Private universities may find themselves in the same boat coming forward. And so now is the time to potentially start creating understanding and socialization across campus that this may no longer be a nice to have, but a must have. And so those types of cultural changes in an institution can take some time. And again, it requires a significant amount of support for your partner units across campus to be able to make the kind of changes they need to make in order to come into compliance. And so these are some of the bigger ideas that you may be able to tackle if you're in a position working at the central level of the institution that can have a ripple effect of positive change across the institution as a whole. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up here and open the floor for questions in a couple of minutes, just by talking about some next steps that you can take today, right? We gave you a little bit of a list of activities that you can start putting together to support your content editors across the institution. But in thinking about how you're going to start, we really recommend that you build a roadmap for yourself, for your team, for your group of accessibility champions, or whatever organization of your colleagues is focused on this. Think about a roadmap of goals and how you can move forward for yourself and for your team. You're not going to be able to tackle it all at once. Building a mature accessibility practice takes time. It takes consensus building, it takes socialization, and it takes continual reassessment. So if this is a new responsibility for you, if you're here with us today because this responsibility is new to your area, we would certainly recommend starting with a current state scan of your site to understand your current landscape. How compliant are you? In what areas are you out of compliance? And where do you need to be able to sort of tackle that first? And so we typically, once we're working with clients who have done that kind of scanning work and have an accurate map of the current picture, then we start saying, all right, so then we need to create a project backlog. Which of those changes are most urgent? And urgency may be defined as it's the biggest sections of the site, the most heavily trafficked ones, the most highly visible ones. Or you may also find what's the low-hanging fruit that you want to pick off first. If you found a significant number of challenges with copy, those might be fairly quick and easy to remedy rather than dealing with underlying technology or document accessibility challenges. So putting that together will help you have a picture of where you need to focus your efforts in both the immediate and the longer term. Putting together that resource library that we talked about is going to help you move from your immediate team's set of needs to working with these broader stakeholder groups to actually implement changes. So then we start to think about what are the resources, what are the trainings, what type of support will you be able to offer your stakeholders in order to encourage these changes to happen across the institution. So you started by organizing yourself, and then we're starting to think about, all right, how can you collaborate with your colleagues across the university, and what do you need to give them to make it possible for them to do this? Prioritization is going to be critical, and that's going to need to be ongoing, right? You're going to need to be doing risk evaluations and continually updating your backlog based on probably the input from your stakeholders, who can and will work with you now, who requires more assistance, more support to work with you down the line. What do they need to do from that? What are the areas of greatest compliance risk? You'll be continually assessing your backlog to see what needs to be addressed when, and what's most urgent and what's most critical. And then again, you should be looking at your VPAT quarterly and making sure that you've got through the changes that need to take place, and that you are updating the roadmap with new requirements as they come out. These are sort of the steps that we see clients take to move towards an ongoing practice of accessibility that takes into account the fact of this changing landscape of requirements, of evolving understandings of need when it comes to accessibility, and ensuring that universities are able to be compliant without asking the impossible of their content editors and their group of stakeholders. So hopefully today we've been able to give you some tips about how to start building or expanding your accessibility practice in this environment in a way that's feasible, that's logical and actionable for you. And with that, I will hand off to Ashley to wrap us up and open the floor for questions.
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much, Cheney and Tom, for all of the information. On your screen right now, everyone will be seeing a QR code. This is really just to get you some tools and resources into applying a lot of the logic and practices that Cheney and Tom have shared. So if you're not sure where to start, you can start with the current state assessment, as well as Acquia is extending an exclusive offer for a free Montecito site scan. So I'll give you a moment, please, if you'd like to scan that QR code. You also can reach out to our team following this webinar, and we will be happy to assist you. And as I give everyone a moment, it is question time. So please start typing your questions into our QA tool that Zoom gives you at the bottom of your screen. We have gotten a couple, so I will start to read those as we move forward. So with our first question, I think, Cheney, you might be the best to answer this. As I read it out, let me know. But the question is, how can we continuously educate our teams about accessibility, especially with frequent staff turnover and changing guidelines?
Yeah, that speaks a little bit to the resources question that we talked about. Building that resource library, something that you can direct new staff to, and ideally one that itself is a living, breathing document, so that it too is updated with regular changes to information. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the webinar, HiEdWeb is a great resource for information about accessibility. In general, there are a lot of higher ed technology communities that share resources with one another and are often very eager to help one another answer those kinds of questions. And so when we think about putting together a resource library, we are thinking about links to the latest information and guidelines. So latest WCAG guidelines, updated information about DOJ rulings and other changes to the regulatory landscape. So it's about keeping some of that stuff up to date and really ensuring that you have kind of a one-stop shop, if you can, of places to go to direct new staff, both to keep on top of what's been offered to date, the information that's out there to date, and to encourage them to return to it regularly to understand what's changing moving forward. So it's incumbent typically on the accessibility office's team to make sure that that information remains up to date and that you are archiving resources that no longer apply and that the resources you're sharing with them are live and including new information as it comes out. But that's typically one of the key recommendations we have is having a space where you can point everyone so that they can do some education themselves, as well as working with your team to get hands-on support.
Okay, thank you for explaining on that. This next one I would say is for Tom. Someone is asking how they can integrate Montecito with their existing CMS, as well as other digital tools.
Yeah, so when it comes to integrating web governance platforms with the CMS, something like Montecito, good news is that across all content management systems, typically these web governance tools like Montecito are able to integrate with them really seamlessly. So they tend to work well together. I'd say in addition to that, there tends to be, for example, what I showed there was, opening up an issue and seeing it on the live site. Typically with integrations, you're able to actually go into the edit environment directly. So that means that your team doesn't have to have a million tabs open. They can work on the content very quickly, right? We know that like a lot of times it can be a little bit of a lot of work to be able to get these tasks complete. So any way where you can make it more efficient and make it easier to make those fixes is really key. So Montecito, like I said, is going to integrate with every single CMS or major CMS that is out there. So
That's great. Thank you so much, Tom. And then here's another one that just came in. how can we build accessibility into our future web design and development projects to avoid retroactive fixes? That's a great question.
I can hop in on that one. So we touched on that a little bit in one of the later slides, talking about baking it into your design system and code base. So this is related to a broader challenge that universities struggle with, right? Which is the relative levels of like consistency and uniformity across university sites on the one hand, and autonomy of standalone sites on the other. Every university finds a slightly different ratio to solve for this, but typically what we're seeing, especially at the larger and more complex institutions, is that most universities do make available a core component-based design system and potentially ability to stand up sites within their own hosting framework to make it as easy as possible for individual units within the university to stand up new sites and pages for new programs, initiatives, new projects, or potentially to update the sites for an overall upgrade. So I see a comment in here, we've had good sets with component-based design, and I think that's exactly right. Essentially, component-based design, in my experience, enables you to solve two conflicting problems, which is, as I just said, consistency on the one hand and requests for increased editorial autonomy on the other. Your site editors, what they want most of all is the freedom and flexibility to design and create the site in the way that works best for them. However, the university also typically has interests in providing some level of governance, guardrails, and control, and accessibility is a huge part of why that approach has really grown over the last years. In the work that I did at Stanford, we put together a component-based design system for our research institute, which had pre-designed pieces that were compliant with university branding, that followed web and accessibility best practices, but that were entirely free for editors to use in kind of a mix and match sort of fashion, which for them, it was much, much easier to stand up those new pages and sites using those components. And yes, they had some limitations on how they could do it. For example, we didn't allow any of them we had no components that allowed unlimited text. Those are some of the guidelines you can put into a component-based system, and accessibility is the same. You can put limits on what types of color contrasts are allowed. That's both within university branding and also within accessibility requirements. So this is the type of thing that solves a lot of problems at the core level, but we do also know that with universities, there's a lot of challenge in getting units that have historically been autonomous to participate in this kind of thing. And to be quite honest, accessibility is a powerful lever to support those discussions. So for those of you who work in the central team and hope to have more units potentially participating in a system like that, the fact that your system is accessible, ideally on both the front and the back end, so not just the design, but also the code base and its capability to work with assistive technologies and the accessibility of the back end content authoring experience, all of those are powerful arguments for why a unit might want to come on to the central system, as opposed to continuing to maintain their own autonomous standalone site. So in our experience, the accessibility conversation is often part of this larger conversation about the relative level of autonomy versus conformity between independent units and the umbrella. And we find it's a core issue and a strong reason why a number of units are now sort of coming more into the central university fold. And it does give you that capability to ensure that you are continually updating the central design system and code base to be compliant, and you are less likely to deal with individual microsites falling out of compliance everywhere you go.
Amazing, thank you. So a couple questions came in. I think actually, Cheney, for our last question, and Tom will be able to have an answer for both, but two of the questions are specifically around fostering collaboration and how a champion can really drive compliance across those different units that, Cheney, you were already mentioning. So I'd love to start if you'd like to answer that first, and then Tom, maybe we get your perspective on it as well before we close out today.
Well, I'll speak to that very quickly. I mean, I think some of the key points we talked about are understanding your unit's desire for autonomy and figuring out how you can align your accessibility goals with that, and help them understand that accessibility and isn't going to be a barrier to what they're trying to do. Indeed, it's going to be a support for the engagement goals that they undoubtedly have for their own sites. That would be the one takeaway I'd suggest when talking with stakeholders and trying to foster collaboration on this topic. But let me pass over to Tom.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that I think when working, across different teams, everybody's going to have different reasons, or each individual is going to have different reasons of why, accessibility might hit more home to them, right? So some individuals, like the legal aspect of it, might hit more home, and it might be more impactful in helping kind of drive the importance around it. And other individuals, it's more of an ethical concern, and from everybody's life experiences, right? We have had interacted with, it might affect, right, your view around accessibility. So I think I would just say, being open to addressing it with different individuals in the way that it makes most sense with them, right? Having that connection with their team, and being able to learn, from them in that way. I think that that's the approach that I would take when it comes to, working with teams across the university or college.
No, I think that's great. Thank you both. Well, we have come up on our time. So both from me, the JAKALA team, as well as the Acquia and Montecito team, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us, as well as for those questions that we were not able to get to, we will reach out with a little bit more detail as well as an answer for you. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.